Now that we've talked about how our nervous system is organized and how our neurons fire and what reflexes are, let's zoom out a little bit and look at our central nervous system. Our goals are to identify and indicate the functions of the major regions of our cerebrum, diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum, to discuss how we protect our central nervous system, describe some common brain dysfunctions, and then talk about the spinal cord and its functions and structure. Again, as a reminder, our central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and our central nervous system for humans starts as a neural tube. And at the end of week 4 of embryonic development, so very, very early, that tube is going to expand and start to form a brain. And the central canal will eventually form the ventricles. So neural development is one of the first things that happens in embryonic development. Our brain has 4 major regions: the cerebral hemisphere, otherwise known as the cerebrum, which is the majority of the volume of our brain. And then deep inside your brain, you have your diencephalon on top of your brainstem. And at the very base of your skull, you have your cerebellum. Let's focus first on that cerebrum, or our 2 cerebral hemispheres, our left and our right brain. This is where the majority of brain structures are housed. When you look at it, you'll see that it has like bumps and ridges. These ridges are called gyruses, and then the sulci are the shallow grooves. We also have deep fissures in your brain. So your brain has lots and lots of surface area, because that surface area is where a lot of the functions happen. We can divide our cerebral hemisphere into 4 lobes, and these line up with the cranial bones that we've already learned. So we've got our frontal on the front, parietal on the top, temporal behind your temples, and the occipital in the back. And again, that cortex is made, the outer layer is made of gray matter, which is the cell bodies, shooting their axons, forming the white matter onto the inside. And then you've got a few basal nuclei scattered around, or islands of gray matter inside the white matter. This is what the brain looks like. Again, we got the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal, and occipital, and here at the base is our cerebellum. And we have 2 hemispheres, a left and a right. Looking at it again, you can see again the frontal lobe, parietal, occipital, temporal, cerebellum in the back. And zooming in, we have the gyruses down into the shallower sulcuses and the deeper fissures. So let's talk about some of the functions associated with different regions of our cerebral hemispheres. And again, the majority of the functions are here. So starting in our parietal lobe up on the top, we have an area called a primary somatic sensory area. And this is where we're going to interpret sensory information that we get from our body. And we create something called a sensory homunculus, which is a sensory map in this post-central gyrus. And so what that means is different regions of our body will send their sensory information to a very specific spot in that primary somatic sensory area. And the amount of space in our brain that we give to that area determines how sensitive we are to touch. So for example, our hand and our fingers have large areas in our brain where things like our intra-abdominal or our legs and hips, those are very small areas. So we're not getting a lot of sensory input from those areas. The things that are sensitive, we give a lot of space to. Nearby, we have our primary motor area. So this is in our frontal lobe. So the sensory input, what our touch is saying, is going to come into our parietal lobe, and it will move just frontal into the frontal lobe, and that's where we'll act a movement. So axons here will form a corticospinal tract in our spinal cord, and will send information to our muscles in our body saying move. In the same way we have a sensory homunculus, we also have a motor homunculus. So the area in our brain, the amount of space in our brain that we dedicate to movement, determines how fine of movement we can do there. So for example, our fingers and our thumb in particular get a lot of space in our brain because we can do very small, fine movements with our hands and also with our muscles in our face. All sorts of diverse and sensitive facial expressions that we can do. Whereas our elbow and our arm, less space, so we can do less fine motor control there. Now, a lot of our brain is given to language, and language is so complex, in part because it's not determined by one area. And we'll talk in our class about Broca's area versus Wernicke's area, but know that Broca's area is in the frontal lobe, and Wernicke's area is in our temporal lobe. So we space out different parts of language, both making words and understanding speech. So you want to think about the differences between these two areas, and in class we'll talk about aphasia, or a loss of language. Finally, let's talk about the things that happen in the very front. So the very front of our brain is called our anterior association area. Our prefrontal cortex is the other name for that. And this is where the stuff that makes us human reside. So we've got working memory and judgment, problem solving, language comprehension about like the finer details of language, the nuance of language. All of this occurs in our anterior association area. And this is the last thing in our brain to develop. For women, that development happens at 2021. And for men, it's not until like 25 that they have a working anterior association area. And so it's not surprising to see young people make decisions without thinking through the consequences of their action, in part because they lack the ability to do so neurologically. Let's talk about a few last functions. So our occipital lobe in the very back, this is where our visual information gets sent. So vision is here. It's interesting that our eyes have to go all the way to the back of the brain. Temporal lobe, however, hearing does not have far to go. It just goes right to the temporal lobe, and we also have smell there, or olfaction. So you want to be able to think about the major functions associated with each of the lobes of our brain. And when we come back, we'll dive into the deeper areas of our brain.